There's a moment that happens in silence, a moment most people never see coming because they've mistaken kindness for permanence. They've confused care with obligation. And when the most emotionally attuned person in their life suddenly becomes unreachable, they don't understand what happened. They search for anger. They look for resentment. But what they find is something far more unsettling: indifference. When an empath stops caring for you, it's not a mood. It's not a reaction you can fix with an apology or a promise to change. It's a conclusion, a quiet, internal decision that happens long before you realize you're no longer part of their world. And the reason you miss it is simple. You were never paying attention to what it cost them to stay. Most people believe empaths are infinitely forgiving, that their capacity for understanding means they'll always be there, always willing to try again, always open to one more conversation. But that belief is built on a misunderstanding of who they really are. Empaths don't forgive endlessly because they're saints. They stay because they're wired to feel everything. And when they finally stop, it's not because they've run out of compassion. It's because they've run out of themselves. The shift doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic exit, no heated argument that gives you something to hold on to, something to make sense of. Instead, there's just distance. A calm, unshakable distance that feels colder than anger ever could. Because anger still carries energy. Anger still means you matter. But indifference means they've already let go. And once an empath reaches that point, there's no going back. What most people don't realize is that this silence was years in the making. It was built in every moment their needs were dismissed, every time their depth was treated like a burden, every conversation where they gave everything and received nothing in return. The empath you knew didn't disappear overnight. They faded slowly, trying to hold on, trying to make it work, trying to believe it would get better, until one day they stopped trying. And when they did, they became someone you could no longer reach. Not because they hate you, but because they finally learned to protect themselves from you. They carried weight no one else could see, not in their hands, but in their chest, in the space between their thoughts and their silence, in the way they learned to read a room before they even entered it, scanning for tension, for unspoken needs, for the emotional climate they'd have to navigate or neutralize. This wasn't a skill they chose. It was a survival mechanism that became a way of life. From early on, they learned that their value was tied to how much they could absorb, how well they could translate someone else's anger into understanding, how quickly they could turn chaos into calm, not for themselves, but for everyone around them. And somewhere along the way, they stopped asking if anyone would do the same for them. The emotional labor was constant, invisible, unacknowledged. They became the person everyone turned to when life felt too heavy, when relationships were falling apart, when someone needed to be heard without judgment, and they showed up every single time. Not because they had endless energy, but because they believed that's what love looked like. That's what loyalty required. That if they could just give a little more, try a little harder, understand a little deeper, maybe they'd finally be enough. But it was never about being enough. It was about being useful. And they didn't see the difference until it was too late. Their own needs dissolved into the background like they were never real to begin with. They stopped mentioning what hurt them because no one seemed to have the capacity to hold it. They stopped asking for help because every time they did, it felt like a burden. So they learned to smile through exhaustion, to say they were fine when they were falling apart, to carry everyone else's pain while pretending their own didn't exist. And people believed them because it was easier to believe the empath was strong than to confront how much they were taking without ever giving back. This wasn't strength, it was conditioning, a belief woven so deeply into their identity that they couldn't separate their worth from their ability to endure. They measured their value in how much they could tolerate, how much disappointment they could absorb without breaking, how many times they could be overlooked, dismissed, or taken for granted and still show up with the same kindness. They thought that made them resilient, but it didn't. It made them invisible. Because when you're always the one holding space for everyone else, no one thinks to hold space for you. When you're always the one who understands, no one believes you need to be understood. And when you never complain, never demand, never set a boundary that might inconvenience someone else, people assume you don't need anything at all. But you do. You always did. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. A slow erosion of the self that happens when you spend years pouring from a cup no one ever thought to refill. And the kindness everyone admired, it wasn't coming from a place of abundance. It was coming from a place of desperation. A need to prove that if they could just love hard enough, give deeply enough, sacrifice completely enough, maybe someone would finally see them. Not for what they could do, but for who they were. But no one ever did. because they were too busy taking what was freely given to realize it was never supposed to be free at all. There's a pattern beneath the surface that no one wants to name. Empaths don't just give because they're kind. They give because somewhere, long ago, they learned that their emotional labor was the price of being loved. That if they could just anticipate the need, smooth over the conflict, absorb the tension before it escalated, maybe they'd finally be safe. Maybe they'd finally be seen. This pattern doesn't start in adulthood. It starts in childhood. In homes where emotional availability was inconsistent or conditional, where a parent's mood determined the atmosphere of the entire house, where the child learned to read microexpressions, voice tones, and silences because their survival depended on it. Not physical survival, emotional survival. The kind that shapes how you move through the world long after you've left that environment behind. So they became emotional translators, mediators, fixers. They learned to overcompensate for what others couldn't or wouldn't give. And that became the blueprint for every relationship that followed. They didn't choose emotionally unavailable people by accident. They chose them because that's where the pattern lived. That's what felt familiar. And familiarity, even when it's painful, feels safer than the unknown. The nervous system doesn't forget. It's wired to detect distress and respond to it, even when that distress isn't theirs to carry, even when soothing someone else means abandoning themselves. This isn't a conscious choice. It's a deeply embedded survival mechanism, a biological response that was once adaptive but now keeps them locked in a cycle of giving to people who were never capable of giving back. And this is where empathic debt accumulates. Every conversation where they listened but were never heard, every moment they showed up but were never met, every time they extended care and received indifference in return, it builds, quietly, invisibly, until the weight of all that unreciprocated emotional investment becomes unbearable. But they don't leave, not yet, because their tolerance for mistreatment is higher than most people can understand. It's not because they lack self-respect. It's because their system is designed to endure, to stay, to hope that if they can just love someone through their dysfunction, maybe that person will finally soften, finally see them, finally reciprocate. Except they rarely do, because people who are emotionally unavailable aren't withholding love because they don't know how. They're withholding it because they're not required to give it. The empath has already created an entire relationship in their mind, filled in the gaps, made excuses for the absence, and convinced themselves that understanding someone's pain is the same as being loved by them. It's not. This isn't weakness. It's a survival strategy that once kept them safe, but now keeps them small. It's a pattern so deeply ingrained that they don't recognize it as a cage until they've spent years inside it. And even then, leaving feels impossible, because walking away from someone they've invested so much in feels like failure, like proof that they weren't enough, that if they had just tried harder, been more patient, loved more deeply, it would have worked. But it was never about effort, it was about capacity. And you cannot make someone emotionally available by exhausting yourself trying. You can't heal their wounds by ignoring your own. And you can't build a relationship on empathic debt and call it love. At some point, the system breaks. And when it does, the empath finally understands something they should have known all along. They were never the problem. They were the solution to someone else's emptiness. And that was never their role to fill. The breaking point doesn't arrive with fireworks. There's no screaming match, no door slammed in anger, no final confrontation that gives closure. It happens in a moment so quiet you could miss it. A moment when something inside them simply stops. Not breaks, stops. Like a machine that's been running too long, finally shutting down, not because it chose to, but because it has no choice. It's a Tuesday afternoon, or a Sunday morning, or the middle of a conversation that feels exactly like 100 conversations before it. And suddenly, mid-sentence, mid-thought, they realize something that changes everything. Their care has been weaponized, their loyalty has been exploited, their silence, the one they thought was patience, was never seen as strength. It was mistaken for weakness, for permission, for proof that they'd tolerate anything. And in that moment, they see it, all of it, not through the lens of hope anymore, but through the lens of reality. The relationship they've been fighting for was never the relationship they were actually in. It was a projection, a fantasy they built in the gaps where real connection should have been. They were loving a version of someone that only existed in their mind. And the person standing in front of them, the real one, never had any intention of becoming that version. This realization doesn't come from one betrayal. It comes from 1,000 small dismissals that finally add up. Every time they shared something vulnerable and were met with distraction, every time they needed support and were told they were too sensitive, every time they set a boundary and watched it get trampled without a second thought, it wasn't one moment, it was all of them. stacked on top of each other, building pressure, until the weight became unbearable. And what's terrifying about this moment is that it's irreversible. You can't unsee what you finally allowed yourself to see. You can't go back to hoping after you've accepted the truth. The empath who believed in second chances, who made excuses, who convinced themselves that understanding someone's trauma meant accepting their mistreatment, that person is gone. Not because they chose to leave, but because they had to. Because staying would have meant disappearing completely. This is where the old self dies, the version of them that measured their worth by how much they could endure. The one who believed love meant sacrifice without reciprocity. The one who thought being needed was the same as being valued. That self doesn't survive this moment, and what's born in its place is something else entirely. Something that can't be manipulated. Something that won't bend. Something untouchable. People don't understand this shift when it happens. They expect anger. They brace for emotion, for tears or confrontation or some outward display of hurt that they can respond to, apologize for, promise to fix. But none of that comes. What comes instead is calm, a stillness that feels foreign, unnerving, because the empath isn't trying to make them understand anymore. They're not explaining, not defending, not fighting to be seen. They've already let go. And that's what makes this breaking point so permanent. It's not reactive, it's conclusive. It's the result of years of invisible labor finally collapsing under its own weight. It's clarity replacing hope, reality replacing illusion. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. Because the empath didn't just realize they were undervalued, they realized they were complicit in their own erasure. They stayed longer than they should have, gave more than was healthy, accepted less than they deserved. And now that they see it, they can't unsee it. This isn't anger, it's awakening. And awakening, once it happens, doesn't reverse. The person you knew is gone, and the person they've become will never be that accessible again. The withdrawal happens slowly at first, then all at once. It's not loud, it's not announced. There's no letter explaining why they're pulling back, no confrontation that lays out everything that was wrong. There's just distance. A quiet, deliberate reclaiming of energy that was never supposed to leave them in the first place. And the people who benefited from their boundaryless existence don't understand it. They call it coldness. They say the empath has changed, become distant, unreachable. And they're right. But what they don't realize is that the person they're mourning never actually existed. It was a version built to keep the peace. A self constructed to meet everyone else's needs while their own dissolved into silence. The old behavior was exhausting, over-explaining every decision as if they needed permission to prioritize themselves, seeking approval for boundaries that should have been non-negotiable, absorbing blame for things that were never their fault because it was easier than watching someone else sit in discomfort. They apologized for needing space, for being hurt, for asking to be met halfway, and somehow that became normal, expected, the price of remaining in people's lives. But now they don't explain, they don't justify, they don't offer lengthy reasons for why they're unavailable or why they're not engaging the way they used to. They simply say no, or they say nothing at all. And that silence carries more weight than all the words they used to give so freely. This isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation, a recognition that their energy is finite and they've been spending it on people who never intended to return the investment. So they stop spending it. They stop showing up to conversations that drain them. They stop carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. They stop being available for roles they were never meant to play. And the people who grew comfortable with their unlimited access, they feel it immediately. The absence, the shift. The fact that the empath is no longer rushing to fill the silence, smooth over the tension, or make everyone else comfortable at their own expense, it feels personal, like rejection, like punishment. But it's not. It's just the natural consequence of taking someone's presence for granted until they decided their presence was too valuable to be treated that way. What others experience as coldness is actually clarity. The empath isn't withholding warmth out of spite. They're protecting it. Because they finally understand that warmth given to people who don't value it isn't love. It's self-abandonment. And they're done abandoning themselves for the comfort of people who were never uncomfortable with abandoning them. The new boundaries feel foreign, unnatural, almost impossible to maintain at first, because every instinct tells them to soften, to explain, to make sure no one feels hurt by their distance. But they've learned something crucial. The discomfort others feel when they set a boundary is not their responsibility. It never was. And the guilt they used to carry for disappointing people who were never concerned with disappointing them, that guilt is a lie, a conditioning they're finally unlearning. So they stay quiet, they stay distant, not because they don't care, but because they care too much about themselves now to keep performing a role that was costing them everything. The empath who once absorbed everyone's chaos has learned to let people sit in their own. The one who used to rush in to fix, soothe, and resolve now watches from a distance, knowing that not every problem is theirs to solve. And the hardest truth for others to accept is this: the empath is no longer available for the version of connection that required them to disappear. They're no longer willing to be the emotional catch-all, the perpetual listener, the one who gives endlessly and asks for nothing. That role is closed, permanently. And no amount of guilt, manipulation, or appeals to who they used to be will bring it back. Because the person they used to be no longer exists. And the person they've become has finally learned to choose themselves. There's a power in walking away that most people never expect from an empath. Not the power of anger or revenge, but something quieter and far more unsettling: strategic absence. The deliberate choice to remove their presence, their energy, their attention from spaces that no longer serve them. And it's in that absence that their real strength emerges. The sensitivity that once made them vulnerable now becomes a weapon of discernment. They can read people faster than before, detect manipulation in the first sentence, spot performative apologies before they're even finished. And instead of giving the benefit of the doubt, instead of making excuses or trying to understand, they simply disengage. No explanation, no debate, just distance. And their silence, it carries more weight than their words ever did. Because words could be negotiated, argued with, twisted into something else. But silence is final. It's a door closing that no amount of knocking will reopen. The people left behind don't know what to do with it. They reach out, they try to re-engage. They offer apologies that feel hollow because they're not rooted in understanding, just in the discomfort of losing access. And when none of it works, when the empath remains unmoved, unreachable, unchanged by their attempts, the realization sets in. This person is no longer available, not temporarily, permanently, because the empath finally learned the truth. Caring for everyone meant caring for no one, especially not themselves, and they're done with that version of care. The person they've become is unrecognizable to those who knew them before. Not because they're cruel or closed off, but because they're no longer soft in the way people expected. They're calm, but you can't reach them. Kind, but unavailable. Aware of everything, but emotionally detached from outcomes that don't concern them. This isn't the empath who used to absorb everyone's pain and call it connection. This is someone who's rebuilt their entire identity around self-respect rather than external validation. Someone who no longer needs to be needed, who doesn't measure their worth by how much they can endure or how deeply they can understand someone else's brokenness. They operate from a different place now, a place of clarity that most people mistake for coldness. They choose peace over proximity. They choose solitude over dysfunction. They choose boundaries over belonging. And that last one is the hardest for others to accept, because the old version of them would have done anything to belong, would have bent, adjusted, sacrificed, and stayed silent just to keep a seat at a table that was never meant for them. But this version walks away from tables where their presence isn't honored. They don't fight to be seen anymore. They don't explain their value to people who've already decided not to recognize it. They simply remove themselves, quietly, completely, without the guilt that used to follow every act of self-preservation. This isn't bitterness, it's wisdom, the kind that only comes from years of trying to fix what was never theirs to repair, from loving people who were never capable of loving them back, from staying in situations that required them to shrink just so others could remain comfortable in their dysfunction. They've stopped doing that, all of it. And what's left is someone who understands that not everyone deserves access to their depth, that their energy is sacred, that their time, their care, their emotional bandwidth are not unlimited resources to be handed out to anyone who asks. They've learned to be selective, intentional, protective of the peace they fought so hard to build. People call this version of them cold, distant, changed. And they're right, they have changed, but not in the way people think. They didn't lose their empathy, they redirected it toward themselves, toward people who actually reciprocate, toward relationships that don't require them to disappear in order to exist. They're no longer the person who saves everyone else while drowning in silence. They're the person who finally learned to save themselves. And that person is unreachable to anyone who only valued them for what they could give. The truth about losing an empath is this: when they stop caring, it's not because they've become heartless. It's because they finally learned to direct that care inward, toward themselves, toward the parts of them that were neglected while they were busy holding space for everyone else. And what's lost when someone like this walks away is more than most people realize. It's not just a person, it's a presence. a rare kind of emotional availability that doesn't come from everyone. The kind of person who actually listened, who remembered the details you forgot you shared, who saw you, not just the version of you that was easy to be around, who held your chaos without judgment and your pain without trying to fix it unless you asked. That kind of presence doesn't exist in abundance, and most people don't recognize its value until it's gone, until they're standing in the absence of someone who gave them a type of attention, understanding, and care they'll spend years trying to find again, but they won't, because people like that don't come around often, and when they leave, they don't come back. This is the cost of taking depth for granted, of mistaking someone's patience for weakness, their silence for approval, their loyalty for permanence. You assume they'll always be there because they always have been, until one day they're not, and no apology, no explanation, no promise to do better will undo what's already been done. So ask yourself this: have you been on either side of this dynamic? Have you been the one who gave until there was nothing left? Or have you been the one who took without realizing what you were losing in the process? Because here's what you need to understand. When an empath is done, they're done. Not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They've learned that some people will drain you if you let them, and they've decided they're no longer available to be drained. Once they walk away, they become unreachable, not because they don't care, but because they finally care enough about themselves to never go back to a place that required them to lose themselves to stay. And that departure, it's permanent.